Culture-based development is the economics of why. But what is this why? What is this big question about? Well, modern economists believe that everything comes from preferences, and preferences come from utility. They're not quite sure how the two relate, but the bigger question is, if preferences come from utility, then where does utility come from, right? Because it will be the source of everything. In other words, why do we derive different utility from the same thing? Why we could have one and the same object and different people will have a different attitude towards it. Think a steak of pork, right? If you are a German, you'd enjoy it with your beer, but this only if you are a German Catholic. And if you are a Jew or a Muslim, you definitely will have a different attitude towards it. So why do we have different attitudes to the same thing? And the answer that culture-based development gives to this big why is culture. Culture is behind this big question, why? That's why we talk about culture-based development. Culture, the big elephant in the room. But how do we define it properly? You all have heard the story of the people trying to describe the elephant in the dark by holding at its trunk and saying it's a snake, or holding for its leg and saying it's a column. Culture-based development has a systematic, structured, theoretical economics approach to defining this elephant. According to the chain rule, whatever stays in the beginning of the chain is the cause of everything else. Well, culture stands behind the utility that we derive from one and the same thing, the different utility. But culture is a complex and dynamic entity. Culture-based development has its book, number 1, which lays out the founding principles of culture-based development. And this is the recently published book, Culture-Based Development, Modeling Cultural Bias in Economic Choice, which was published by the independent publisher Edward Elgar and is coming in July 2020. But there is also another way to tell the story of culture-based development. Many big economists, Marx and Keynes and many others, have used the story of Robinson Crusoe as a very suitable ceteris paribus condition of a person taking decisions in an isolated state on an island. So when writing the first book of culture-based development with its founding principles, I decided to write the CBD culture-based development story of Robinson Crusoe. This story was intended as a prologue to the book. So in this story, Robinson Crusoe is the person who makes these culturally relative decisions over very simple things. Things like eating apples. Essentially, some people would love apples and others not. And most economists will start from here, their modeling. For culture-based development, the question is rather to apple or not to apple. This is the question. And where the answer to this question comes from. In other words, for economists, this is the question, why do we have a taste for discrimination of apples over pears and just about anything else? In order to answer it, culture-based development has introduced the notion of cultural capital, and in the Robinson Crusoe story, this is nicely presented in the sense of what it means for Robinson Crusoe. His part of cultural capital, which comes from his past, is his cultural heritage. If we assume that he used to have a house in Italy, which used to have a nice balcony, when he suddenly finds himself on an island, this way of building houses would inform him to try build his new house with a balcony, even if the island is stormy and inappropriate for it. Till he learns this by experience, it will be his first instinct coming from the cultural heritage he has. That's why he will do balconies rather than not do balconies. The thing that we know from the past is relative. And why we all know the example with the swastika, in the Robinson Crusoe story, we can present the same relativity using the cross. The cross can be something sacred in one culture and something completely different in another culture. And we do know this also for some much more blasphemous signals, such as the middle finger, which in our Western culture is an insult, but there are different little societies in which it's the way and mode to greet each other. Robinson Crusoe has also a kind of living culture, which starts shaping the moment he finds a society to belong to in his little island. For culture-based development, you need at least two people to form a culture. Before this, it is just your own learning of survival, what to value and what not to value. It becomes culture when it is a shared code with somebody else, by which code you decrease each other's uncertainty and you start belonging to something common together. A common code for decreasing your survival uncertainty. And this starts being a market for values. And in the case of our Robinson Crusoe here, he became part of the local community by marrying a lovely local woman. And I'll leave you to this, explore the story yourself. And the balance between what he came with on the island and what he found and started belonging to on the island is this balance that culture-based development terms cultural entropy. There are proper academic papers about it, and you can learn about cultural entropy in chapter 4 of the book of the main principles of culture-based development, but it's also very well illustrated by the life of our CBD Robinson Crusoe. And the balance matters about the choices, what will prevail, his sticking to his past or his loyalty to his present. And thus, in the book, you have the structure where the main notions that I just engaged you with, the culture of a place and a person, the cultural capital and its division into living culture and cultural heritage, the cultural distance that then our Robinson Crusoe and the people on the island will have, the cultural entropy in the balance between the cultural heritage and living culture within the same person and place, and ultimately how this creates cultural bias is the main core of the mechanism why culture matters, why it has the power to create different utility in us, and how to measure it really. Once we know this main toolkit of culture-based development, we can start applying it in order to explain main and important outcomes, direct and indirect ones. Outcomes such as where people go to migrate, cultural gravity, whether people will cooperate with each other wherever they are, migrating or not migrating, something which we call the altruistic contract curve in culture-based development, and also indirect effects from the direct ones above. You can have cultural frictions among places. People choose to go to one or another. The one that experiences less attraction actually experiences more cultural frictions. But the aftermath for it are not only that it attracts less people, but once it has less people, it has less ideas, and gradually over time, it produces progressively less, and it flourishes less than the places that have less friction, that are more rich of cultural gravity. Then, even more dramatically, the places that are not able to attract people and do not allow them to flourish can actually collapse into a great transformation. And this is a direct effect of the inability of the people living locally to any longer cooperate with each other. In other words, the altruistic contract curve dissolves, and this allows for a great transformation to emerge. And all these different direct and indirect effects emerge. Why? Because there is different degree of cultural entropy locally, with which the distance between the different cultural capitals of people is experienced locally. If the cultural entropy is between 0 and 1, you have the milder effects of cultural gravity and cultural frictions. If cultural entropy is close to 0, then the altruistic contract curve starts dissolving and the great transformation is likely to happen. The many other applications of culture-based development have been done for various examples, from voting to local innovation and research and development, to the case of labor productivity, to the case of well-being and happiness and feelings of loneliness. The whole spectrum of socioeconomic welfare and well-being can be explored as a result of this big why. And the way that this is done is called value-free analysis of values, because culture-based development does not say that one culture is better than the other. Culture-based development only measures how the treatment of everything in the world, how the attitudes to the world are affected by culture, and vis-a-vis a certain outcome of interest. So culture-based development is an evidence-based way to understand how local culture affects certain outcomes of interest without judgmental attitude to culture itself. It's a scientific approach to understand the impact of culture on everything else. In other words, you have the first 5 chapters about culture-based development, covering the culture-based, how culture is based, why culture is based. And then you have the different applications, the D part, the development part from culture-based development, from the CBD. Now, this might sound complex. That's why it was summarized in the story of our Robinson Crusoe, where you have all these elements illustrated to his experiences on a desert island. And if you are curious about going into this, and if you want to have a look at the story itself, you're very welcome to do so. It's a fun story, but it's a wise story that tells you in a simple way the more complex things which are available in the book. Enjoy!